Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Blair Monk and I'll be your moderator for today. Oh, hello for people from Singapore, I see just coming in. Now we've got a number of people from across the New Zealand, Australia and all over the world joining us today. So it should be an interesting discussion and we've got some great presenters. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about ITS New Zealand, just to get the plugs in. So membership of ITS New Zealand gets you conferences and awards, the things that we're supporting being members. Lots of learning opportunities available, and it has cross-government engagement. We are pushing youth and diversity into the ITS world, and we're promoting through industry and communications and research. Now, we've been around since 2004, and we're the leading body on intelligent transportation and future transport systems in New Zealand. So really advocating education and links to government and academia. And we're part of ITS Australia and the ITS World Networks. Now here is a number of our members. So as you can see, they are across government, across mobility, automation, information technology services, professional services and consulting, engineering services, electrical and manufacturing, and educational research organizations. And if you'd like to get some more information on joining ITS New Zealand, then please contact Simon McManus, who's on screen at the moment, or Armin Gutka, who's our Director of Membership. A couple of the upcoming events we have is putting the SAS back into mass. So looking at super shuttles and mobility as a service. Now this will be an in-person and online event. It's a hybrid event. So that's 28th of April, and the location for in-person is at the Mobley office, 187 Queen Street in Auckland. That will have networking, drinks and nibbles, and it will also be on Zoom. So you need to register for that through ITS New Zealand. And we also have an on-demand events with VIA. So this is going to be in person and online. June 20th to 23rd, locations Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. Registrations and more details coming soon. And we have our premier event for the year, T-Tech. More information will be coming on that, and details are on the ITS New Zealand website. Now we have a great lineup today for our webinar on congestion pricing, and we have a great expert panel of Marian, Wilberg, Michael Roth, Scott Wilson and David Bolt. I'm just your moderator, Blair Monk, so I'll be keeping them in line and try to keep them to time. So we'll move forward. There's a couple of housekeeping rules. Please use the Q&A questions and answers on Zoom. There's a button there for you if you want to load any questions you'd like asked of the panelist. The questions will all be answered at the end of the session. That's when we've got time for them. We'll get through a few for each of the presenters. Please include your organization's name and your own name so we get a context of what the question's about and why it's relevant. And only one question at a time, otherwise it gets far too difficult for us to manage. All right. Okay, Thank you all very much. Now, our first presenter is Marian Wilberg. Marian, can you share your presentation? Well, I just give a little bit of a background on who you are. Right, so Marian is the Manager, Demand Management and Revenue at Te Manatu Waka, the Ministry of Transport. Now, Marian advises the government on why and how to influence transport choices and revenue policy. Marian has oversight of funding tools for land transport, including road user charges, fuel taxes, and tolling. Her work includes exploring congestion charging and what a more sustainable, equitable, and efficient revenue system for land transport might look like. Marian has previously been the Transport Ministry's Technology and Transport Systems Policy Manager. Thank you, Marian. Please take it away.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Marian Wilberg toko ingoa. As Blair has introduced me, my name is Marian Wilberg and I'm the Manager of Demand Management and Revenue at the Ministry of Transport. I'm hoping you can all see my screen there. Right, so I'm going to talk to you about what the government has been doing most recently on congestion charging, a bit about context, the Congestion Question project, and clearly for this audience, a bit around technology as an interest. Talk also about the Select Committee inquiry that has occurred on congestion pricing in Auckland, around the draft emissions reduction plan and how that fits with considering congestion pricing and some of the issues we are having to consider. So this will probably be a very quick canter through a whole lot of things, and apologies for might needing to go quickly. I think we probably all understand some of the context here. You know, population growth in New Zealand is really expected to occur, particularly in Auckland, and that's going to put pressure on our roading network. And the real challenge with congestion is delayed journeys and making journey times unpredictable, which makes it difficult for businesses to deal with deliveries and delivering services, and also limiting the economic, educational and social opportunities. So the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which was a partnership between government and Auckland, considering a strategic approach to transport issues in Auckland, concluded that investment in both infrastructure and demand management tools were needed to reduce congestion in Auckland. And a key kind of definition here for us is that congestion pricing is a demand management tool, focusing on changing travel behaviour to reduce congestion and improve the performance of the road network. So we kicked off a cross-agency project called the Congestion Question, made up of a range of agencies: Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, the Ministry of Transport, Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, the Treasury and the State Services Commission. And the aim of the work was to undertake a thorough investigation sufficient to support a decision on whether to introduce congestion pricing in Auckland. The first phase of our work was published in 2017, and it really did demonstrate that congestion pricing showed promise to address congestion in Auckland, and particularly had a look at what has been happening overseas and international experiences to show both the benefits that were there, but also lessons. What could Auckland learn from? The second phase of the work took a long list of 26 options and then narrowed those down into 5 potential schemes for more thorough assessment. And the 5 schemes were a city centre cordon, an isthmus area, strategic corridors, a regional network, and a combination of a city centre cordon and strategic corridors. And these were assessed against key criteria of network performance. So how well did they perform in terms of congestion outcomes? We also did cost benefit analysis, environmental outcomes, and social and practical considerations. So the congestion question work concluded that congestion pricing could support Auckland to achieve something like an 8 to 12% reduction in traffic. I've called this here the school holiday effect, but we all understand that in school holiday times, the roads appear to be much freer and easier to move around. TCQ's technical papers were published in November 2020, and they recommended a region-wide strategic corridor scheme, so targeting those roads that are most congested but perhaps starting with a smaller area like a city centre. It considered that an access charge might be best, and this was a bit of a debate around which types of trips are we trying to target. And an access charge really seems to get more at the short trips, the overwhelming trips that are below 5K in Auckland. It modelled a range of tariffs and was thinking about higher tariffs at certain times of day, obviously peak periods are most important, and considering a daily cap. The project was also actually very concerned with mitigating the impacts of congestion pricing on vulnerable households and starting to explore how you might invest in transport or provide other means to support those who are negatively impacted. Particularly focusing in on our recommendations around technology, we concluded that the ANPR technology is the most feasible enforcement option in the short term for congestion pricing. And that's not to say that in the future that there isn't in-vehicle technology coming that could be expected to offer more sophisticated congestion pricing solutions. And we know that technology is moving ahead all of the time. When we were doing this work in particular, there were concerns about security, about privacy, logistics of getting any devices into the number of vehicles you need them to be in, crossed barriers, all things that would actually just need to be worked through. An interesting point that we found though is that actually even with a GNSS-based system, it's highly likely you would still need an ANPR network as a backup enforcement. So GTQ had done a whole lot of work. The Minister of Transport decided that a good way to progress the discussion was to request a Select Committee inquiry. So the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee picked this up, asked for submissions from the public and held hearings around the country in Auckland and Wellington to hear people's thoughts on congestion pricing in Auckland and what the issues might be and what the opportunities might be. So the Select Committee, it was quite a thorough investigation and a very engaged group of people. And the conclusions were, then recommendations, so the government should progress legislation to enable congestion pricing in New Zealand. Recommended actually progressing with an Auckland scheme similar to that proposed in TCQ. Also recommended undertaking broad public engagement to help people understand the costs and benefits. It recommended that any revenue raised by congestion pricing should be used to mitigate the equity impacts. Also recommended closely monitoring the effectiveness of any scheme to be able to actually respond to any unintended issues arising. In particular, they were interested in rat running. So then what do you do with this information? Well, the government has to formally respond to a Select Committee inquiry, and the government actually, in general, supported all of the recommendations of the Select Committee. What it has done though is said, actually, we need to hear back from the draft emissions reduction plan. So it was sent out for consultation, and there were two actions in there quite explicitly about should we be progressing congestion pricing legislation and should we be progressing a congestion scheme in Auckland. Because that was out for consultation, the government has said it needed to hear back from all of the public views, and the government will be making final decisions in the middle of the year of what will be in the action plan. Now you might be asking, how well does this link into actually emissions reduction as opposed to congestion reduction? But congestion pricing really, in combination with other measures, has a role to play in reducing carbon and harmful emissions. We've noted that other jurisdictions have reported improvements in both harmful emissions in air quality and carbon emissions in areas where congestion pricing has been introduced. So, should we get permission to proceed, we will need to develop legislation. At the moment, you cannot legislatively charge for congestion. Key issues to be considered, actually both by the government and by any cities considering and wanting to bring in congestion charging. Funnily enough, these will align up with the Select Committee recommendations, but equity all the way through all of our discussions have been a key issue. How do you identify those who will be most negatively impacted, and how might you address those provide options or means or support. What to use the revenue for, and it's one of the lessons from some of the international schemes, is it's incredibly important what the money gets spent on, so how do you use it? Also, consultation communication. There will need to be a big engagement with the public to actually even just understand what we're trying to do, the benefits and costs, and how and when you best do that process. So that was my canter through everything currently in the government space.
Thank you, Marian. That's great. That was a great history lesson on congestion charging, where it's been and sort of where it's going. So that's great. Now we've had a couple of questions come through on the presentations. The presentations will be shared with everybody that's registered for today's event. So those will be made available to you. And there's also going to be a recording that will become available on the ITS New Zealand YouTube channel. So that will be available in the next couple of days. Okay, so we'll now move on to our next presenter, Michael Roth. Michael, can you share screens while I just give a little bit of a background about what you do? So Michael is the lead transport advisor for Auckland Council. And Michael's been working on congestion charging, emissions reduction, parking, safety, and supporting councillors. Michael has over 25 years transport policy experience, primarily in Australia. With degrees in manufacturing, engineering, and psychology, Michael focuses on human-centered design and mobility behaviour. Michael worked for the Queensland Government Transport Department in central policy, legislative development, and roles related to sustainability, congestion reduction, and improving walking, cycling, and public transport. Michael then became the public policy advisor for the Royal Automotive Club of Queensland to broaden their advocacy focus on motoring or focus from motoring to mobility. His work included progressing the road user charging policy. Prior to moving to Auckland in July last year, Michael worked for a transport modelling and planning company to expand their business, including innovative modelling scenarios, mobility policy, and future transport technologies. Okay, Michael, please take it away.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Blair. So I'm Michael Roth. I'm lead transport advisor for council. So my focus is very much on working with the councillors and assisting Auckland Council in this process to develop a congestion charging scheme. As Marian advised you, the Ministry of Transport is responsible for building the enabling legislation, but then council will have to work with Auckland Transport to actually design the scheme. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us to implement the scheme. In order to not go over the similar ground to others, I'm going to focus on the road pricing objectives that we will be keeping in mind as we go through that design process. Bearing in mind, it's a key issue for us to keep the councillors engaged and on board with this, and the councillors need to be confident that the community will support it. I'm now trying to change the slide. There we go. So I'm going to outline 8 objectives very quickly. So first one is whatever we do needs to be consistent with transport policy, strategy, and planning. That's clearly very important, and there's a good history of that in Auckland and New Zealand through the congestion charging project. So anyone who has been interested is well aware of the history of this. So far we are consistent, and as Marian advised, the Auckland Transport Alignment Project foreshadowed this years ago. But we also need to consider that this is beyond the transport sector. So central government needs people involved from across other agencies, and council needs to ensure that we have a broad coalition of supporters. It's not just the people in the transport side of things. The second objective, and for me this is very important, is that the scheme needs to be perceived as effective in addressing public concerns. Now, we talk just about congestion, but public may have other concerns that are more important to them, or they think of as aligned. We need to make sure that we're not missing the main point for them. So that's why I put in this photo about social cohesiveness. Transport isn't just about congestion or about costs. It's about how people live their lives. So we need to make sure we are delivering what the community wants, and that we need to position our scheme and ensure that we are actually successful so that we can retain support as we seek to expand it. So objective 3, manage travel demand. That's pretty straightforward. I expect most people listening will be well versed in travel demand management, and the congestion charging is a great opportunity to do that. Obviously, there's a lot of economic theory, a long history on this space, and also a history of successful implementation. That's a graph from Stockholm. The first red bar is their initial trial, which demonstrated success in reducing traffic flows into the central Stockholm area. And then they stopped the scheme after the pilot, and then they started again once they got community support for a permanent implementation. Very clear success there. We can try to design the scheme with a lot of flexibility, different fixed and variable components, but we also need to bear in mind that the community understands things better when it's quite simple and you don't have to worry too much about different aspects of it. There will always be trade-offs. Now, the other side of demand management is, of course, a sustainable source of revenue. Our excise duty on fuels, our road user charging on diesel vehicles, they face, well, there's concerns of decreasing revenue in the future because of the introduction of electric vehicles. So we need to look at other funding sources, and funding for use of the road, and particularly for congestion is an obvious one. We should not focus on revenue. Revenue is a benefit that we achieve and an opportunity for us to then recycle that into an improved transport system. And I would suggest an hypothecation of the revenue is a critical issue here to help retain community support and to also demonstrate that the scheme is resulting in a better city, which in the end is what we have to convince the community of. Objective 5, has to be cost effective to implement and operate. This goes to the complexity of the scheme, the technology choices, the business rules, and so forth. If a lot of the scheme revenue is used up in operating and administering, enforcing the scheme, then that means there's less for us to recycle, there's less benefit, and it's not seen as particularly efficient. And for instance, the London scheme has suffered somewhat from this issue. So we need to be careful in our choices to make sure that we deliver a cost-effective solution. Protecting privacy and securing the data are critical components of it. Again, dependent somewhat on technology choices, and presuming that we go with an ANPR solution, it's perhaps less of a a problem than if we went with GNSS, but it's still critical that the community is confident that we are not tracking all their movements and using that data for other purposes, and the system is able to protect their information from any other actors that may seek to misuse the data. Perceived as fair and equitable. Now, this for me is probably the most critical at the end of the day, and our councillors have already made it clear that equity is their major concern. Auckland is a car-dependent city, so there are also a lot of low-income people who are quite dependent on cars. We need to factor that into our design solutions. We don't want to go down the path where we have so many different discount or exemption schemes that it makes it overly complicated and expensive to administer. But we need to be very careful with our design choices so that we can demonstrate equity to the majority of the community and the stakeholders. And we know that equity is very complex. It's horizontal, it's vertical, it's geographical, and that everyone will have their own specific take on what the equity issue is for them. So we really need to have our heads across all those different angles on equity and be able to defend our solution to all those different perspectives, so that we are introducing a new road price. Not everyone is going to benefit from that. We have to be confident in our explanations to those who may not benefit. And I suppose to finish it all off, transparent, engages stakeholders and elicits trust. A lot of the objectives until now have all been about putting it together so that this is what we can achieve. If we cannot achieve a level of trust across the community, then I'm unlikely to be able to convince our councillors that they need to vote to implement this. So that goes to the equity point, but it goes to all the detailed design of the scheme. Trust is a hard thing for governments and councils to get now, and that's getting harder and harder, and it's not easier for any other organisations. We need to do a lot of work to build a level of trust, because this is a significant reform. The graph there is again from Stockholm, demonstrates that there was a reasonable level of support early on, but not majority support. When they got close to implementation, that's when the level of support gets the lowest, because people get scared of the upcoming change, and assuming that the scheme does actually work and delivers the benefits in congestion reduction, then the community will feel some relief and realise that it's not as bad as some may have imagined, and there are actually benefits, and then levels of support will go up. So we need to be aware of those issues, and it's quite critical with regard to timing of our approach. We don't want to be in that spot where the community will be very scared and force our politicians to have to make a decision. So this is, for me, the most critical. And to get that trust, we obviously have to engage with the community and be transparent about our process. So just to finish off and emphasise the public acceptability spot, we have advanced the process a lot. We're probably somewhere around that first hump in this graph. We've got sufficient support to go ahead. We've had, as Marian said, the select committee come forward supporting it, so we can go ahead now. But now we've got the tough slog of actually putting together the detail, doing the hard work, and coming up with a scheme that our politicians and our community can support. Hopefully we get through that and we get the commitments and we get it built so that it can operate, and then it can move up to become a program that really does address congestion and other positive impacts for the city, and grow into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great introduction to the objectives of congestion pricing. Really simple, the reasons behind it, betterment and trust, those types of things. Really, really great. Okay, Scott's our next speaker today. And Scott, do you want to start sharing your screen, and I'll do a little bit of an introduction of who you are. So Scott Wilson, a client service lead for road user charging at CDM Smith. Now, Scott leads CDM Smith's, formerly known as Milestone Solutions, road user charging practice for Australia and New Zealand. He's worked for clients in the USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Hong Kong, UAE, and the European Commission. He specializes in advising on strategy, policy, planning, governance, regulation, economics, and for road pricing. Most recently, he advised Auckland Transport and the Ministry of Transport on the Congestion Question project. Scott gives advice to the Australian Federal Department of Infrastructure and Transport on its National Heavy Vehicle Charging Pilot, and has worked on a number of road user charging pilots in US states. He writes the world's only blog on road pricing, which is http://roadpricing.blogspot.com. And Scott's recognized internationally as an expert in road pricing, who has authored numerous policies for governments and cities and states, and presented at a number of conferences, including the ITS World Congress. And he's led the policy and strategy advice for congestion pricing for Manchester in the UK, and peer-reviewed the New York congestion charging scheme. Thank you, Scott. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Blair. I just want to go through, there's quite a bit of material, but I want to talk around experience internationally in congestion pricing. I just want to give a few indicators about what some of the success factors and failure factors are. And I thought I'd start by just doing a bit of a definition of congestion pricing. And I put up here 5 examples of what congestion pricing is. And usually with congestion pricing, we think about cordons. And I've got a map there showing the Stockholm scheme and a list of the cities that have got that. But there's also corridor charging, which I think is important. And Singapore is a mix of cordon and corridor. And Singapore has, I think 70 odd. I'm sure there's someone from Singapore on this who knows better, but there are a lot of charging points. Network charging has never been implemented for congestion pricing as of yet. Brussels is planning to do so. One city has area charging, which is London. The difference between area and cordon being that you are charged for driving around the area, not just for entering and exiting. And there are toll lanes, which is often talked about at congestion pricing. It's not really what we think about in New Zealand, but you can put a price on a single lane, but it's only been done in the US and only in specific contexts. And I don't think it's particularly applicable to New Zealand. So if you look at the history of congestion pricing, and I started doing this with a number of points and it just filled up, and I'm not going to read them all out, but there's a few key points here to note. In 1975, Singapore was the first introduction of some form of congestion pricing with its area license scheme, basically a cordon with paper licenses. In the 80s, Hong Kong actually started the first technical trials. Now, Hong Kong doesn't have congestion pricing now, but it shows you that you may start early down a path and it may not actually get you very far. But Hong Kong did do the trialing of electronic-based road pricing before anybody else. I mentioned the Netherlands because the Netherlands have tried and not got anywhere. They have attempted 5 times to do some sort of congestion pricing, whether it be city-based or nationally. And they started in 1990. I've mentioned the 91 express lanes in California because this is full free-flow electronic tolling being introduced, which is important. We take it for granted now. But in 97, Singapore introduced what we have today and know as electronic road pricing, and is still, by my measure, is the gold standard of congestion pricing anywhere in the world. We'll all have known about London. It introduced it in 2003. I think what's notable in London is that if you look at London then for congestion charging today, it hasn't changed that much except for the pricing and a few of the policy details. I mean, I've highlighted Stockholm in 2006, which has already been discussed. The thing about Stockholm is that it was based on having a referendum, which was won, but there were 2 referenda in the UK which were lost, in Edinburgh and Manchester. And I've highlighted Abu Dhabi because it's the latest implementation. It's a very straightforward cordon-based scheme with peak pricing, but it's the most recent one. What we have in the future are 3 possible developments, but I'll get to them shortly. So if you look around the world, congestion pricing on all lanes remains pretty rare. And all of the cities with the red stars have got congestion pricing. The ones with the yellow stars have said they are going to implement congestion pricing, but haven't got there yet. And you have to ask yourself, well, it's been around for so long. Why is it so uncommon? And I've listed a few cities there that have tried and failed. I mean, Edinburgh, Bristol, Manchester, Copenhagen. The government was elected on a platform that included congestion pricing, couldn't do it. And it wasn't technology. And if you think it, congestion pricing is a pretty well proven policy. We've seen that it reduces congestion, it generates net revenue. These are 4 of the well-known examples of what it's done. We know that it can deliver a lot of benefits. And if you look at negative impacts, so far they've been a function of design. And the one I've highlighted here is Gothenburg, which in Sweden has introduced it since Stockholm. But the analysis after it was introduced showed that no users have any net benefits. What that graph is showing you are income groups. So from poorest to the left to the wealthiest on the right. And even the highest income drivers in Gothenburg are net losers from the Gothenburg congestion pricing scheme. And it's proven to be, unlike the Stockholm one, quite unpopular and continues to be a point of contention. And the reason is it wasn't designed to reduce congestion. It was designed to generate revenue, but it was sold on the basis of reducing congestion. And so a revenue generating scheme that doesn't generate net benefits to those who pay can be a bit of a problem. Now, we know technology isn't a barrier. As has already been mentioned in earlier presentations, number plate recognition works well. It enables you to do pricing on particular points of the network quite economically. And while GNSS-based technology has been proven on a network basis for RUC, as we see in New Zealand and in other countries, it has not yet been applied to urban congestion pricing yet. And you don't need it unless you're pricing on a large scale. Longer term, the likely technical solution is OEM telematics. It's telematics built into the vehicle, but it's still embryonic. There are only 1 jurisdiction, Utah, has actually implemented this for any form of road user charging, and it is only flat distance-based road user charging there. The key reason congestion pricing is rare is public resistance. The biggest barrier is always public acceptability. Public just don't believe it's going to benefit them. Often they don't believe it'll relieve congestion, but they do tend to think it's just another tax, just another way to make money out of people, and there's nothing in it for them. In some cases, schemes are proposed that confuse the public as to where and when it will apply. One of the reasons I'd cite, and it's not the main reason, why Manchester failed was because something like 30 to 40% of the people in Manchester, when polled about the congestion pricing scheme, which was a cordon proposed, thought that they would be charged for using the ring road outside the cordon, which is a 6 to 8 lane motorway, has 150,000 vehicles a day at any one point, which actually you could double because people don't go around it, or many people enter and exit it. So there was a whole segment of the population thought, well, we're going to be charged to drive around this cordon, and we've got no alternative because public transport doesn't serve that. So there was poor communication as to what the scheme would do and who would pay for it. And I think the poor experience of pricing tolls elsewhere can undermine confidence. London, which was initially a success, has found it very, very difficult to expand it because now it is seen as simply some sort of toll to raise revenue. And no other major UK city has introduced congestion pricing because they look at London and say it's congestion. It doesn't work. And in Australia, while there are lots of tolls in 3 cities, they're not seen as relieving congestion. And every year, most of them go up by price by the Consumer Price Index. So people just see it as another way to make money. Saying, oh, we're going to introduce some sort of pricing to relieve congestion, they'll look at toll roads and say, well, the M5 is congested in Sydney. And what do you mean it's going to relieve congestion? And what are the elements of public acceptability? The first one, I think, is most important. You have to clearly communicate the objective and how it will be achieved. The more objectives you have will confuse or undermine public confidence. And I think similar to that is that any system has to reduce congestion, improve trip reliability and travel times for those who pay. And improving that level of service is key to getting public acceptability. I think another reason in some of the UK attempts it failed was because no one communicated the savings that people would get. Again, in Manchester, there was a lot of communication about what the money would be spent on trams and busways, but the drivers said, well, that's not me. That doesn't suit me. It might suit some people. It's not going to improve my trip to work. And that was a key barrier to getting acceptability. I think it's important to say mode shift is important, but it's not the only alternative. In Stockholm, half of trips shifted mode, but the rest of them shifted time or just consolidated. People travelled less frequently. I think the design needs to focus on charging people where or when congestion occurs. And some of the attempts that have failed have been because they've designed a scheme that applied on roads that people saw, well, that's not congested there. It's not congested at that time. In Gothenburg, the system runs all day long. In the middle of the day, you don't have congestion in Gothenburg. So people say, well, you're just making money out of us. And to be fair, it's true. And the use of revenue is important. But if you focus on raising revenue, it will turn people off. So people need to know the money is going to be used in a way that they find acceptable. But if you just talk about the money, they're going to go, oh, that's all you're really interested in. So I'll just highlight a few trends. One of the big trends in the UK is it's embracing low emission zones to meet air quality targets. And there's an increasing number of those. But this isn't congestion pricing. It doesn't raise a lot of money. It'll have some impact on congestion, but it's basically a tool for environmental policy. Now, they both can do, they give you environmental benefits, but it's clear to understand it's not congestion pricing. And while a lot of US cities are studying congestion pricing, all of them are driven by revenue. And only one of them, which is New York, looks like it's seriously going to implement it. San Francisco may come second, but we'll see. In some jurisdictions are talking about RUC, road user charging, that is charging by distance across a network alongside congestion pricing. But this can confuse the debate and can delay both policies. We're seeing at the moment the UK is actively talking about road user charging, road pricing with a congestion pricing element. And I'm just not sure that that's going to help either of them progress. Because if you talk about that, you have a lot of people outside congested cities will say, well, what do you mean you're going to charge me by time of day? Or you have to wait till the whole of the country rolls out technology to enable this. So I think mixing objectives can be challenging. The two big next technical developments I think are worth observing. The first one is Singapore, and Singapore has been delayed somewhat, but it is going to introduce onboard units with GNSS telematics for the electronic road pricing scheme next year, which will replace its 1990s era system. But it's mostly about providing more information to drivers, improving public amenity. You'll see the image there of the gantry in Singapore. These gantry, they won't need to have gantries like this to enforce it, and enabling more flexibility over time. So we'll be interested to see how Singapore goes. And I think equally, in fact, more interesting is the Brussels region will be trialling next year using an app on mobile phones as a pilot trial with the aim to replace their very high vehicle registration fees, which range from the hundreds to the thousands a year in euros, with paying by distance, time and location, and using mobile phones with a backup of ANPR cameras. So that'll be quite an interesting development. And my final slide here is I think to take the big lessons from overseas. The first one is you need to prioritize public communications at the right time about where, when, and how congestion pricing applies and how it benefits them. That message is the most important. I've mentioned the use of net revenues. I think a system should be flexible and scalable. You don't have to start by having a complex scheme. Singapore started with a cordon in the 70s. Now the Singapore scheme, you'd argue, is very complex. If you try to put every single charging point in Singapore has different prices at different time intervals for different vehicles, but most people don't know that. They just need to know what it costs to go where they're going. But you can get to that point in the long term. I'd also say that it's not just like a toll system or a public transport fare system. It's much more interactive. There's a lot more customer service complexity involved in this. And it's interactive in the sense, iterative, I should say, in that the outcomes that you get from managing congestion should feed into what prices you pay. And that doesn't tend to be what happens with tolls or public transport fares. It's already been mentioned that you should minimize discounts and exemptions, both for admin cost purposes, but also enforcement. The more complex you get these, the more opportunities there are for fraud. I've mentioned the proportion of behavior change that is not going to be about modal shift. And I'll take one survey the Grattan Institute did, which indicated that nearly a fifth of car trips to central Sydney and the AM peak are for social, recreational, or shopping purposes. This is before 9:30 in the morning. They're not going to work and not going to school or university. They're going for discretionary purposes. Take out half of that traffic and imagine what the impact would be on congestion. I mentioned ANPR systems. They're needed regardless of any technology. So start with that first. You may move to other technologies in due course. And last and not least is don't lose momentum. Edinburgh is an example of losing momentum. They started in 1999. They discussed it with the public. The public said, yeah, it's quite a good idea. By the time they got to a referendum on it, the public were fed up with it. They saw there were lots of competing objectives. There was more complexity, and they just voted it down. And Edinburgh hasn't looked at congestion pricing seriously for nearly 20 years now. So other than that, thank you very much for your time.
All right, great stuff. Thank you very much, Scott. That was a good history and great examples from around the world. And that revenue versus congestion issue keeps popping up, it seems. Now, our next and final speaker is David Bolt. David, can you put your presentation up, please? And David is the Vice President, Sales and Solutions Consulting, APAC, for Kapsch TrafficCom. David Bolt earned his Masters of Engineering from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and international business degree from Nanyang Technology University in Singapore. He has more than 12 years experience with product development, engineering, regional group management, business development, and consulting. At Kapsch TrafficCom, David is responsible for managing the ITS portfolio and connecting clients with solutions as Vice President of Sales and Solution Consulting for Asia Pacific. David has always maintained an active customer-focused approach to balance the expectations with what can be achieved with an outcome-oriented approach. Thank you, David. Please take it away.
Thank you for that, Blair. Thanks for the trip down memory lane back to my university days. I really can't remember them anymore, but apparently I did that. So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Also, my privilege to be here today on this fantastic panel. I really enjoyed listening to Scott, Marian, and Michael. I absolutely agree with a lot of the statements that were said there. What I'm going to talk about is from a lens of technology. What's the readiness of technology around this? But I'm also going to talk around demand management. I've heard themes come up through the variety of the speakers today, and I'm going to talk really about how this, in terms of road user charging or congestion charging, how it really needs to glue into the demand side and how we start to manage that. Okay, so from our point of view, Kapsch, we're an ITS provider, a global ITS provider. And from our perspective, what we've learned is in order to achieve a world without congestion, it really takes a holistic, integrated approach. And what I mean by that is we need to start to look at the instruments, the change levers that affect both supply and demand. Now, in terms of looking at this, 3 areas commonly that we look at in order to start a foundation. 1, what is the policy? How do we shape policy? How do we start to put those pricing models together? The intelligence that we have to then use those change levers. So, for example, how we identify patterns, how we start to model them. This comes into the key point, I know Scott also mentioned as well, around really make sure you design what you're trying to achieve. Spend time in that area and make it outcome based in terms of getting your model right. I can't stress that enough. Really engage with understanding what is it that you want to achieve and put the design framework together. And then collecting data, but more appropriately, collecting the insights, because data is useless without understanding the insights that it provides us. And what we need to put at the center of this is the traveler. It's something that's often forgot. How do we communicate with travelers? It becomes a socio-engineering challenge in terms of change management. How do we influence behavior, better road user behavior? How do we influence behavior to more greener, more sustainable forms of transport? It becomes this knowledge transfer exercise of changing people's habits. And that is extremely difficult to do. It's like telling somebody who's right-handed to pick up a pen with their left hand and start writing. So we really need to, in order to do that, we need to show the benefits that a charging regime creates. We need transparency, and we need to ensure that all of that is put together in a way that creates some positive outcomes. So let's look at some strategies and some solutions that we have today. Now, policies typically follow one, not both, of these 2 strategies of supply and demand. There's policy set up to only look at supply, or there's a policy usually set up to only look at demand. What happens is we're not integrating these 2 together to understand that demand management picture. So we've got incentive schemes, space management, that's also known as curbside management, for example, how we manage space, especially in urban areas. Access management, I'll talk about that later on. And then you've got the supply side of understanding what's in the network. What's the utilization on the roads? What is the occupancy on trams, buses, trains? Where are the bike lanes? What is the area, the distance that bike lanes have? How do we promote that? How do we understand the supply that's available? And there's, from an ITS perspective, from an application perspective, there's a variety of different tactics to support these strategies. We go from carpooling, very common in, for example, in the United States, where we're actually looking, we're enforcing that by looking through the windscreen of vehicles in order to ensure that there are 2 or 3 or more people in the car. Space management, curbside management, that we don't have a fixed way of just using the curb, that we can use that curb for different purposes, whether it's for freight, whether it's for pickup and drop off, whether it's for parking, for example. Congestion charging, it's just one tactic. How do we control the access? How do we control people moving in and out? And then you start to link that in with traffic management, using corridors, using load balancing techniques. And I think there was a little bit of a mention around it today of looking at a corridor approach. And this is when you start to get into these layers of the macro, meso, and micro layers of a transport network. How do you look at it from a country point of view, like Singapore? Do you look at it from a meso point of view of just corridors? Or do you look at it from a point of view of a micro aspect of single areas that are more high congestion zones? So what we need to do is glue these together. We need to fuse both supply and demand. We need to gain situational awareness of the demand in the network. And we need to understand not just what is the supply, the availability, but how better to use that supply and incentivize others in order to do that. Again, a lot of this is around changing the habits of travelers in order to use a multimodal form of getting around, or to take a different journey in their vehicle, for example. Simply adding capacity is short-lived. It's short-lived. We can't just keep building roads. I like to think we don't just want to move cars, we have to move people. And if you understand how to then move people around a network, we become agnostic a little bit away from just vehicles. So let's look at these two a little bit later on of how to glue these together. I talked about levers, change levers. So what is available to us in terms of the inputs that we have in order to go and make decisions and try and influence people's journeys? Well, one of them is, who is this person? Is it a private, is it a commercial vehicle? Is it a business, resident? Do you have an electric vehicle, for example? How are you getting around? What's the class of your vehicle? What's the size? What's the cubic capacity? What form of transport are you using? What's the emission class? When do you want to travel? The time of day, the actual day. Now, this is a huge area in terms of what COVID has done as well, is that we're actually seeing other peaks, not just the typical morning and evening peaks. We're seeing different peaks happen throughout the day and on different days. I saw today in the Age in Melbourne, Monday and Fridays are extremely quiet in the city. People aren't coming in. Those were typically some of the busiest days of commuting to the CBD. Where is congestion? Where is it happening? Where are the high pollution areas? And what are we going to use to try and incentivize this from a charging point of view? Fixed, staggered, or a dynamic way? There are an awful lot of inputs. There is an awful lot of change levers here, and it becomes a cause and effect model. If you make one change at the start, it could have a knock-on effect across all these other areas, both for a positive and a negative point of view. How on earth do you measure that? How do you understand what is the cause and effect, and has it been a positive outcome by changing some of these levers? So one topic that has been discussed is around satellite tolling, or GNSS. Now, GNSS, the technology is certainly available. It's been implemented, and essentially how this process works is it looks at an origin to destination matrix. So we start to see where a car or a vehicle is traveling, or a person within the network even, and we start to influence that person's journey around the network to take different routes. So for example, if there's a busy corridor, we can load balance that corridor by influencing that person to take a different road, for example, an arterial. Perhaps rain has introduced an element, the weather. Perhaps that's something that we want people to avoid the road because it also creates a safety hazard as well. So by using GNSS or satellite-based solutions, we can work out how to pivot different people around the network on how they get from their origin to destination. And when you type that into your navigation, say, for example, traveling from home to the airport, 47 minutes, that information is then known. It's known where you're going to be in 47 minutes. And that information is so valuable in order to plan that person's journey, because you know where they're going to be at each point in time. You suddenly know where that person's going to be in 47 minutes. So we can start to use that information. Now, I just want to take one area of access, urban access management, and around how we use this for congestion charging. It was being mentioned around different ways to do this. There's cordons, there's zones, there's distance. There's also a way to restrict this as well. How do we use permits? How can we pivot heavy goods vehicles around areas? And I think some of these strategies, there's not a silver bullet here. There's not one that is the ideal way of doing this. The most constructive way is how this benefits the traveler. What is the outcome that they expect to have? And I'll give you one example on permits around this one, around access control. There was a topic of low emission zones. It's something that's actually the city of Madrid has implemented. And where that can be applied is in terms of freight corridors, how to pivot heavy goods vehicles off roads and onto other corridors. And that's very important on roads, especially in urban areas where a vehicle has to take that journey in an urban area. and especially for things such as around school zones. Now, there's a lot of activity done around reducing speed in school zones, but there's no activity done in trying to reduce the density. And as a father, that's a very important part for me to understand. It's great that we're reducing speed at a school zone at that particular time of day, but how are we addressing density? How are we moving heavy goods vehicles away from those areas? And we need to do that by communicating with those vehicles, take them on different corridors, put them on designated freight corridors so that there is an emission reduction as well. But how you do that is through communicating with the person in the vehicle. And at the end of the day, it's a human being with a steering wheel, a brake, and an accelerator. How do you change that person from shifting their travel is through incentivizing them to say, you're going to have a better user experience if you take this route. It's like toll roads. You want to be able to have a very strong user experience on a toll road and not be congested, because that's why you're paying the charge. The congestion charging regime, for example, in London, only penalizes people that are going into the city. What it needs to focus on is that you're going to have a better journey if you pay this charge, because we've been able to distribute the demand around the network. We've told people to change their time of day. We've told people to take a multimodal journey. We've rerouted heavy goods vehicles around a low emission zone away from schools. Now, we can only do this if we understand the demand and we understand the supply, and we apply the levers together in unison, that we can start to load balance a network. And most importantly, communicate that to the traveler. So here's the example here around no rules around a school zone, for example, in a hospital. What we can do is route that particular vehicle or person around that area. And the same from an environmental point of view, with the sensors that we have that are gained within an ecosystem, we can start to understand in real time how to pivot and create those freight corridors and do them both together. This has been achieved. I just want to raise an example here. It's one that's not often talked about, but in Bologna, in Italy, this was 10 years ago. What we implemented was a way to manage and limit traffic around low emission zones. And this curbed congestion, it curbed pollution. It was then backed up with an enforcement system of using ANPR. And I agree with Scott, start with ANPR, the technology is available, it's commercially off the shelf, it's affordable. Start there and you can start to iterate as technology evolves. But really, the other factor of why this was so important and so successful was that the revenue was being made transparent to the citizens. For every euro spent, it was published how that money was getting used. There was transparency. People could see the benefit. And if people can see the benefit, whether it's better travel reliability, reduced congestion on roads, safer school zones, for example, people are going to then change their habits because you see a positive outcome. And my advice as well is don't just try and tell people what to do, give them options, give them choice, make it more equitable. If you tell me, David, you must leave your car at home today and take the bus, otherwise I'm going to charge you $20. It doesn't give me any options. I want to be presented different ways of traveling. Maybe I'm looking for a reliable journey today. Maybe I'm late for my flight and I need to get to the airport as quick as possible. But if I'm not in a hurry and I'm after reliability or a more sustainable way of moving around, then I want that option to be able to select. Somebody else might be very different. So I could talk for a long time around demand management and how these strategies come together, but I just want to end on, it's so important that you understand both, get that situational awareness, apply those levers. And I think what we've had here in Australia with our fuel exercise charge halved from 44 cents a litre to 22 cents a litre, my opinion, the government has missed a fantastic opportunity to make public transport more affordable, look at how to get people around more easier if they're not near train stations or near a bus. All that's done is put traffic back on the roads, and I've seen it happen already. As soon as that occurred, traffic has gone up around Melbourne. We can't just reduce fuel charge. We have to be able to balance that across all forms of transport and promote a multimodal ecosystem. Thank you very much for your time. Very much look forward to the questions.
All right, thank you, David. Great presentation, strategy versus instrumentation, and about the principles, who, how, when, what, all really good. And the levers available, grizzly babies in the background as well. So I think you managed that terribly well. So now we get to question time. We've got a few questions there. Panelists, please remember to unmute yourself if you're going to answer a question. We've got one here from Marian to start with. It's one from Bridget Ferry, Transport Engineer in Auckland. For New Zealand, what's the overall goal for congestion charging? Reducing trips overall, reducing congestion during peak periods, collecting revenue, discouraging vehicles in central city? How does it work? Yeah.
So the government in New Zealand has yet to actually determine what its objective is, and that will be a key thing to state. I mean, the work that we've done through the congestion question so far has really been trying to improve networks. I think support the whole question of, if revenue is your objective, then you probably would set things up in a different way. I think we're very keen on the demand management aspect, and as an official, that's likely what we'll be recommending. But where New Zealand government will go, we're yet to hear.
Right, thank you for that. Okay, one for you, Michael. Politically, how ready do you think New Zealand is for congestion pricing? Is there anything more that needs to be done at an official level to support bold political decisions? That's from Erica Walker, a transport planner in Tauranga.
A lot still needs to be done to support bold political decisions. Similar to David's point before, we've just seen fuel excise and RUC reduced in New Zealand. Fortunately, we've also seen public transport fares halved for everyone, so a bit better than the Australian response. But clearly cost of living is a major issue now, so now is not the time to be doing public communications around congestion charging. Timing is very important, and also thinking about what benefits are there for the community. We need to focus this on building better cities, not just on congestion. I'm not saying that we need to call it a low emission zone or clean air zone or something else, but we need to have a positive vision. This is not just about charging motorists. This is about building a better city, and we need to go through the process to get through all the complexity that David and Scott discussed, to come up with something that the community can understand and can accept that there's likely to be some benefits. We need to be very careful with early implementation. That's why we're looking at probably going for a city centre scheme to start with. It's the most equitable solution because the alternatives are in place: good walking, cycling and public transport access, fairly small area. So it's not going to worry the majority of the city. And it's a way that we can demonstrate benefits. We actually have to be very careful going through the process. We don't want to get into the type of situation that Scott described for Edinburgh and Manchester, where they ended up having a referendum that killed the scheme for various reasons, often associated with complexity and timing issues. So we've got a lot ahead of us to build that support, to do the hard work, to design a scheme that the community can understand. And we really need to do those hard yards. And also, timing is important with the alternatives provision. So Auckland is currently building the City Rail Link. That is expected to be delivered around the end of 2024. Now, once that gets delivered, we have a substantial improvement in our rail system, particularly in terms of servicing the inner city area. and the overall capacity of the network. That is a great opportunity to then say, well, we've improved the public transport system. Now is the time to actually implement some other levers that will help manage demand, help use that capacity that we've just provided to help build a better city.
Thank you for that, Michael. All right, got one here for Scott from Veronica Marker in Auckland. What's the best example of congestion pricing to date that you've seen that would be applicable to New Zealand? And why would it be?
I think that there's two ways to approach it. I think the first thing to observe, Singapore is the gold standard because of outcomes. It runs at a low cost. It is highly effective at ensuring trip reliability and reducing congestion, and it's highly responsive to that. Prices go up and they go down. It is the purest example, you could say, of responsive road pricing anywhere. How applicable is it to New Zealand? Well, it shows you can do that. But of course, half of people in Singapore don't own a car, and the people who own a car have to be fairly wealthy because you have to buy a permit to own a car, which is about the price of owning a car. But where in the world have they implemented congestion pricing in a car-dependent city of lower density? The answer is nowhere. So for Auckland, it's very much doing something a bit new. Gothenburg may be more comparable. It is much more car dependent. It's a much smaller city. I've already talked about the things that are wrong with it, but it shows that it actually does, for the congestion they've got, it does work. It does run at a very low cost. It was implemented in a very short period of time. I think there are lessons to learn positively from both of them for quite different reasons.
Great, thanks for that, Scott. One for you, David, from Rich Mitchell. He's an ITS expert from Brisbane. If congestion charging is not just about collecting revenue, but about levers and shifting modes, what part does technology play in this?
Yeah, good question, Rich. Technology, from my perspective, I think what we see is there's these information silos. The first start for us is understanding those levers. How far do they go? So what I mean by that is here in Melbourne, Yarra Trams. Are Yarra Trams talking to the buses talking to the trains talking to the city? How are the councils all talking? So all those modes of transport, there's these silos that they're not, one's not talking to the other. Now you've got to achieve that baseline, first of all, that you have a multimodal, multi-stakeholder system, this umbrella system that looks over everything, because that's how you can start to communicate between those agencies to incentivize, and also start to, most importantly, communicate to travelers. And an example there is, if the train to work, for example, is extremely busy and they're a regular user, you don't want them to have a poor journey experience, then you'd provide that person options through their traveler app to say, did you know there's actually, the buses are actually quite, they're not busy, they're at 23% occupancy on this day. And if you do that, I will supplement 25% of your journey. So if you present a financial option to pivot somebody from a train to a bus, you can only do that through understanding what is the supply on both, what is the demand in terms of, you know, that this person is going to take it, and how do you communicate across the train and the bus and communicate to the traveler. Sounds complicated, but really this is what an umbrella system presents, that you can fuse that together. And then you can measure the effectiveness of that. And when that person finishes their journey, you're trying to get feedback. The other way is also looking at casual users, and they're the hardest. People that dominantly take their car, how are you going to move a casual public transport person across? My view is understanding their persona and saying, well, most likely you want to get there more reliably, or do you want to get there faster, or is it going to cost you less? You can only do that through communicating in multi-stakeholder environment, because that's just not something that's commonly done at present.
Thank you, David. All right, got one here for Marian, and it's the same question for Michael as well. It's from Tim Booth, and he's a transport engineer in Auckland. Equity issues normally seems to derail congestion charging projects, especially if they're cordon-based. How can you implement it without disadvantaging those delivering further from key services and facilities? Go with you first, Marian.
It's a really good question, and that's a lot of what we've been trying to discuss. I think it can probably be addressed in multiple ways, and one is, what are you offering in terms of alternatives? So public transport, walking and cycling, what is available? I think you can probably also design schemes if you're thinking about actually how the tariffs are set up, where the scheme actually goes in terms of the types of trips or which trips it's actually going to impact on. There's also the potential for subsidies or refunds or discounts or financial support. None of these are necessarily easy answers. They're either going to cost money, or it's actually quite difficult to target those you're most worried about. So it's definitely an area we need to keep working on. We're always open to any good ideas about how to protect those who are most vulnerable and are going to be most negatively impacted.
Okay, thank you, Marian. Michael, have you got an opinion on this?
Oh, yes. So as Miriam said, exemptions for certain levels of mobility impairment where they have no choice but to drive. That's critical. Focusing as to the extent possible on where there are reasonable alternatives to access by car. So walking, cycling, public transport. And that's why I also believe that hypothecation of any revenue back to improvements into transport is critical to demonstrate that we're being equitable by improving alternative ways to access so that people do not have to pay. Focusing the timing, so the timing, through the day or through peak hours only, so that people who are travelling out of hours when there isn't much congestion don't have to pay. That's important. And obviously the geographic area, if you focus on an area where there's a much higher proportion of high income jobs and not a high proportion of low income residents, then that's a good equity response. They're the main issues that come to mind now, but equity will clearly be a major part of Council's considerations as we build this.
Okay, thank you for that, Michael. Scott, one here for you. Should congestion pricing be implemented as part of a transition away from fuel tax?
I would be cautious about trying to link the two. And the reason being, fuel tax is collected across the whole of the country and the whole of the fleet, the whole of the petrol fleet, sorry. And congestion pricing is a tool to reduce congestion in cities. So if all very well in Auckland and perhaps Wellington, you might argue one or two other cities. But if you're in Whangarei or in Invercargill, what is congestion pricing going to mean for you? Well, you'd argue in both cities that you don't need it and it would be inappropriate, and the technology to implement it would be unnecessary. I mean, New Zealand already has the basis of a solution to replace fuel tax. It has road user charging. It's had it now since 1978. It applies to all vehicles over 3.5 tonnes and all diesel vehicles. It can be expanded to other vehicles. Look, there are a few issues in doing so. The transition does require a few things to address, but congestion pricing is a different tool for a different purpose. I don't see it as a tool as to fund, to nationally fund the roads and public transport.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that, Scott. Another one here for you, Marian, from Tim Crow, Transport Engineer in Auckland. How is congestion charging being supported by other demand management measures, and how does it fit into the transport system's response to the wider transport objectives?
Good question there. Yes, it is one tool, and I think actually David and all the other speakers actually have kind of talked about how it's part of a system. It is one option in terms of addressing your demand side issues. Yeah, we need to think about a range of things. Pricing can be used for other purposes, the provision of public transport infrastructure or services. In terms of thinking about our transport outcomes and how you want to achieve them, you should be actually using a range of tools, and they're going to be best used in combination as well. So solely pricing may not give you everything, but packaged with communications, information, with other infrastructure and services is probably going to give you your best result. So pricing and congestion pricing needs to be part of a package of considerations. And I think Michael as well kind of indicated towards what we're trying to achieve is livable, workable cities. This is not necessarily about transport, it's actually achieving bigger goals. So yeah, definitely takes a multiple pronged approach.
Okay.
I might add to that, Auckland's a member of C40 cities, so we have very ambitious emissions reduction agenda, and we're just going through the process of trying to work out how to best implement that. Congestion charging will be a key aspect of how we get our transport sector emissions down, and how, because we need to do a lot of mode shift as part of this. Electrification will be a component, but substantial mode shift is required. Congestion charging will help that process.
And actually, thank you. Sorry, I feel my very first answer, the very first question was a bit inadequate, because we've been talking about the government's emissions reduction plan and how congestion pricing fits into that broader picture of reducing emissions. So encouraging mode shift is likely going to be a very strong recommendation of the New Zealand government to reduce our carbon emissions. So demand management, encouraging mode shift, encouraging alternatives.
Great answers. Thank you very much. I suppose you've only got a couple of minutes left. One here for Scott. What's the difference between implementing tolls and congestion pricing?
Well, there's a number of them in New Zealand. The most obvious one is that congestion pricing is currently illegal and tolls are not, and there is a process for implementing tolls. Tolls are implemented on new infrastructure to recover the costs of building and maintaining that infrastructure. Tolls are not implemented as, people use the terminology, but it's not a term I use to describe implementing a price on an existing road. So that's the difference. The difference in implementation, of course, of a new infrastructure is it wasn't there before. You've got the toll for the new infrastructure, so you choose to pay the toll to use the new route, and there are two in Tauranga and one north of Auckland, or you continue to use the existing road. And that's a very different proposition to communicate to the public and engage with the public than a busy road, which is what congestion pricing is on, with a lot of demand, where you're saying, well, as of this date, you're going to have to pay only on certain times of certain prices. It's much more complex and usually involves a lot more people than we've built a new road. It's your customer choice to use it and pay or not.
And maybe just to add to that, I agree, Scott. I think, it's moving the discussion from charging to rewarding. And I talked about before habits, how you influence people's habits to improve their driving habits or habits on a network away from a car. We need to look at, if we get away from fuel tax at the pump, how that it becomes a rewarding scheme as well, because that's really how we can pivot people. And I'm not just talking in dollars and cents. It's rewarding people, again, from a variety of different backgrounds. A leading airline has introduced green credits recently in order for you to fly green and a green tier, so that is trying to promote carbon offset by making more of a contribution to flying in that way. There's other ways of, as I said, people wanting to get more reliably around, more safely around. You've got to appeal to different people, but what's clear is there's an outcome. There's a benefit to a variety of different people, and we need to reward those people rather than it's a charge. It's coming across in a negative way. We need to focus on what are the benefits coming through that this would bring. That tolling at present doesn't. It funds the project, as Scott said.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, panelists. That was a great discussion and great answers. There are more Q&A questions coming in, and they're coming in thick and fast, and I can't keep up with them at the moment. But we'll leave those open, and we'll try to get some of the panelists to answer some of those directly back to the participants online, if that's an option. Simon McManus, is there any closing comments you would like to make from ITS New Zealand?
Well, I just wanted to echo what you've said there, Blair. Fantastic presentations by everybody. Great, clearly depth of experience and expertise. So we really do appreciate the time that you've given us today. Really engaged the audience, clearly. Lots of people tuning in today, so that's always great. For those of you who are interested in the recording, we'll get around to putting that up onto the ITS New Zealand YouTube channel as soon as we can in the next few days, I'd say by early next week, realistically. And I really hope you enjoyed the webinar today. Welcome to send feedback through to me and look ways to we can continue to provide valuable webinars and events for you. Thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. We're looking forward to see where congestion charging turns up in New Zealand. Okay, thank you. Have a great day.